The rain beat against the tall windows of Boston Public Library's rare books department, casting elongated shadows across the worn oak tables. Margaret Lowell had been the head librarian for 15 years, but rarely ventured into the archive's basement where decades of forgotten documents slumbered. Today was different. The city's Tercentenary Committee had requested materials for an exhibition on Boston's educational history. "You'll find everything cataloged by decade, Arthur," the elderly archivist wheezed as he guided Margaret through narrow aisles of metal shelving, "though anything before 1910 might need some detective work." Margaret nodded, watching Arthur shuffle away before turning to the task. She pulled several boxes labeled Boston School Records 1900 and 1909, setting them on a research table beneath a flickering fluorescent light. The first two boxes contained mundane administrative records, budget reports, building maintenance logs, teacher certifications. It was in the third box that Margaret found a leather-bound registry from the Beacon Hill School, dated 1904. The spine cracked audibly as she opened it, releasing the musty perfume of aged paper. Inside were meticulously handwritten student records, each page documenting names, addresses, guardian information, and attendance. Margaret was about to set it aside when a notation in the physical characteristics column caught her attention. Crescent mark, left shoulder blade. She frowned, turning the page. Another student, crescent mark, left shoulder blade. By the third instance, Margaret's academic curiosity was piqued. She began marking pages with small post-it notes, counting as she went. 2 hours later, she sat back, her spine stiff from hunching over the registry. 12 students, all enrolled during the 1904 academic year, all bearing identical birthmarks. The students shared no obvious connections, different neighborhoods, varied socioeconomic backgrounds, no familial relations. Find anything interesting? Arthur's voice made Margaret jump. Actually, yes. She hesitated, unsure why she felt reluctant to share her discovery. Some students with the same unusual birthmark. Probably nothing. Arthur leaned over the registry, adjusting his thick glasses. Peculiar that they document such a thing. School records from that era rarely included physical descriptions unless relevant to health concerns. Exactly. What I was thinking, Margaret closed the book, a strange unease settling over her. I'll take this one for the exhibition. It's distinctive. That evening, Margaret couldn't shake thoughts of those 12 children. She lived alone in a narrow brownstone in Beacon Hill, just blocks from where the school once stood. After dinner, she spread the registry across her dining table, copying the names and addresses of all 12 students into her notebook. Charles Porter, Emma Whitaker, Samuel Thornton, Julia Preston, William Hayes, Theodore Blackwell, Catherine Simmons, Edward Fitzgerald, Grace Holloway, Henry Sullivan, Eleanor Davis, Robert Montgomery. As Margaret wrote the final name, the lights in her apartment flickered momentarily. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against her windows with unusual ferocity. She shivered, suddenly aware of how quiet her apartment felt. Just a coincidence, she murmured, tracing her finger over the words crescent mark. Yet she couldn't help wondering what connected these children, and why had someone found it important enough to document. Margaret didn't realize it yet. But by bringing that registry out of the darkness of the archives, she had set in motion events that had waited patiently for over a century. And somewhere in Boston, beneath layers of urban development and buried history, something stirred in response to names long unspoken. Margaret awoke with a start, her neck stiff from falling asleep at her dining table. The registry lay open before her, and her dreams had been filled with faceless children standing in rows, their left shoulder blades exposed to reveal identical crescent marks. She checked her watch. 3:17 a.m. With a groan, she rose and moved to her bedroom, but sleep proved elusive. By 6 a.m., she surrendered to wakefulness and made coffee, her mind still fixed on the 12 students. At work, Margaret bypassed her administrative duties and returned to the archives. If the registry had documented the birthmarks, perhaps other records might explain why. She pulled city newspapers from 1904, medical journals, and additional school documents. By mid-afternoon, her research had yielded little, until she discovered a small envelope tucked between the pages of a medical examiner's quarterly report. Inside was a sepia photograph of children lined up against a brick wall, shirts removed to expose their backs. Although their faces weren't visible, someone had written on the reverse, Beacon Hill School, the mark 12, 1904. What exactly were they documenting? Margaret whispered. Talking to yourself is the first sign, you know. Margaret turned to find Diana Chun, the library's digital archivist, smiling at her. Sorry to startle you. Arthur mentioned you were researching something unusual. Margaret hesitated before showing Diana the photograph and registry. 12 students with identical birthmarks. The school specifically documented it, then took this photograph. It seems clinical. Diana examined the photograph carefully. This is unsettling. Were birthmarks typically documented in school records? No. That's what bothers me. Diana's expression grew serious. Have you checked what happened to these children? The thought hadn't occurred to Margaret. I haven't. Should we... Boston Globe archives are digitized back to 1872, Diana offered. We could search the names. 2 hours later, they stared at Diana's computer screen in stunned silence. Of the 12 children, 11 had died within 2 years of the photograph, fall from different causes. Fever, drowning, fall from height, carriage accident, home fire. Each death reported as tragic but unrelated accidents or illnesses. Only one had survived beyond 1906, Eleanor Davis. This can't be coincidental, Diana whispered. Margaret felt cold despite the stuffy archive room. What happened to Eleanor? More searching revealed that Eleanor Davis had lived a long life, passing away in 1982 at age 85. Her obituary mentioned she had been a recluse who never married, residing in the same Beacon Hill home her entire life. The house might still exist, Diana suggested. I need to see it, Margaret decided, surprising herself with her determination. Something happened to those children, something connected to those marks. As they prepared to leave, Arthur approached with another box. Found something else that might interest you. School board minutes from special meetings in 1904, quite a few emergency sessions that year. The first entry, dated January 18, 1904. Read. Discussion regarding the matter of the marked children. Dr. Harrington advises observation protocol. The last entry. November 30th, 1906. Final report on the 12. Matter concluded with one exception. Surveillance to continue for subject ED. Margaret and Diana exchanged glances. ED Eleanor Davis, Diana whispered. The only survivor, Margaret added. That evening they stood before a narrow townhouse on Pinckney Street. The facade was well maintained but showed no signs of current occupancy. Property records show it was sold after Eleanor's death but has changed hands several times without anyone living here long, Diana said, checking her phone. Margaret approached the front steps, drawn by an inexplicable pull. In the fading light she noticed a small design carved into the doorframe, a crescent shape barely visible beneath layers of paint. Diana, look at this. But as Diana joined her, the streetlights above them suddenly went out, plunging the street into darkness. In the darkness of Pinckney Street, Margaret fumbled for her phone's flashlight. The beam illuminated the crescent carving on Eleanor Davis's doorframe, now seeming to catch the light in an unnatural way. Power outage? Diana wondered, glancing up and down the street. Just this block, Margaret observed, pointing to lights still visible a few streets over. She returned her attention to the door, a strange compulsion overtaking her caution. I want to see inside. Margaret, we can't just break in. Look, Margaret interrupted, pushing gently on the door. It swung open with a low creak. It's unlocked. Diana grabbed her arm. This is trespassing. Something brought us here, Margaret insisted. Don't you feel it? These children, whatever happened, it's not finished. Perhaps it was academic curiosity or something more inexplicable, but Diana relented. They stepped into a foyer frozen in time wallpaper from the 1970s, furniture draped in sheets, thick dust coating every surface except. Margaret noticed with unease a path through the center of the house that looked recently disturbed. Someone's been here, Diana whispered. They followed the path to a study at the back of the house. Unlike the rest of the residence, this room appeared well maintained. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a roll-top desk occupied the center, its surface clear except for a leather journal. Margaret approached the desk slowly, drawn to the journal. The leather was worn but not dusty, suggesting regular handling. Opening it revealed handwriting that matched the final entries in Eleanor Davis's obituary, the trembling script of an elderly woman. This is Eleanor's, Margaret breathed, turning pages filled with increasingly erratic writing. The entries began in 1980, October 5th, 10th, 1980. I am the last one now. The mark burns tonight. They're looking for a new 12. December 3rd, 1980. I've identified 3 children born with the mark. God forgive me, but I've alerted the others. The cycle must be monitored. April 29th, 1981. 7 identified. The convergence approaches faster than the last time. I've left records for those who will continue after me. The final entry dated just before Eleanor's death, January 8th, 1982, 11 found. The last will appear soon. I've done all I can to prepare the way for the next guardian. When the 12th is marked, it will awaken. May they be stronger than we were. Guardian? Awaken? What was she talking about? Diana asked, peering over Margaret's shoulder. Margaret turned another page to find a list of 12 names, children born between 1979 and 1981. With mounting dread, she recognized the final name. "This is impossible," she whispered, pointing to the last entry. "Margaret Lowell, born October 31st, 1981, Mark confirmed." Diana stared at her. "You? You're one of them?" Margaret's hand unconsciously moved to her left shoulder blade, to the crescent-shaped birthmark she'd had since birth, a mark her mother had always called her little moon. How could Eleanor have known about me? Margaret's voice shook. And what did she mean by guardian? As if in answer, the journal's next page contained a photograph, the same 12 children from 1904. But on this copy, their faces were visible. Margaret gasped. The child identified as Eleanor Davis was her own mirror image. The same eyes, the same slight asymmetry of features. "She looks exactly like you," Diana breathed. Suddenly, the lights in the study flared to life, bright enough to make them shield their eyes. When the glare subsided, they noticed a section of bookshelf standing slightly ajar. Diana approached it cautiously. "It's some kind of hidden door." Together they pulled the bookshelf further, revealing a narrow staircase descending below the house. Cool air rushed up from the darkness, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else, something ancient and organic. "We need to go down there," Margaret said with certainty that surprised even her. "Are you insane? We need to leave. Call the police and tell them what? That I've found my doppelganger from 1904 who somehow knew I would exist." Margaret shook her head. "Whatever's happening. Whatever connected those children to Mitha. Answers are down there." She took a step toward the staircase, then winced as a sudden burning sensation spread across her left shoulder blade. Diana watched in horror as a dark stain appeared through Margaret's blouse, blood seeping from her birthmark. "Margaret, you're bleeding." But Margaret barely registered the pain, her focus entirely on the darkness below. "I can hear them," she whispered, "the children. They're calling me." Before Diana could stop her, Margaret descended into the darkness, following voices only she could hear. The staircase spiraled downward, far deeper than any normal basement should reach. Margaret's blood-stained blouse stuck to her skin as the burning sensation intensified. Behind her, Diana followed reluctantly, her phone's flashlight casting eerie shadows against the rough-hewn walls. "These stairs can't possibly fit beneath the house," Diana observed, her academic mind struggling to rationalize their surroundings. "We must be under the street by now, maybe even neighboring properties." Margaret barely heard her, focused instead on the growing whispers that seemed to emanate from the darkness ahead, childlike voices speaking in unison. Just below the threshold of comprehension, the stairs finally opened into a circular chamber that defied explanation. The ceiling arched 20 feet above them, supported by columns inscribed with symbols neither woman recognized. At the center stood a stone table, and surrounding it, 12 alcoves were carved into the walls. "This is impossible," Diana breathed. "This chamber would require excavating half the block. It can't exist." Margaret approached the central table, her birthmark now pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. The surface was bare except for a shallow depression in the shape of a crescent. "They built the city on top of this place," Margaret murmured, somehow knowing this was true. "It was here first, long before Boston." As she spoke, the alcoves began to glow with faint blue light, illuminating what Diana had initially missed: small sarcophagi, 11 of them occupied by child-sized remains, each skeleton bearing a metal plate where the left shoulder blade would be. "The marked children," Margaret whispered. "All except Eleanor." Diana backed toward the stairs. "We need to leave. Now." But Margaret seemed entranced, moving to examine each alcove. "Charles, Emma, Samuel," she recited, reading names engraved on each sarcophagus. "They didn't die in accidents. They were brought here." "For what purpose?" Diana's voice trembled. Margaret's fingers traced the empty 12th alcove, which bore the name Eleanor Davis despite containing no remains. She was supposed to join them, but something went wrong. Or right. She escaped whatever fate they had planned, and became the guardian instead, Diana concluded, recalling the journal. Watching for the next 12, Margaret returned to the central table, understanding flowing into her mind as if a dam had broken. It's a cycle. Every 80 years, 12 children are born with the mark. They're meant to be ... sacrificed. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sacrifice to what? Diana asked, though her expression suggested she didn't truly want the answer. Before Margaret could respond, the chamber trembled slightly. Dust fell from the ceiling as a low, resonant sound, like massive stones grinding together, echoed through the space. "It's waking up," Margaret said with inexplicable certainty. "Whatever sleeps beneath Boston, the thing they've been feeding for centuries." Diana grabbed her arm. "Margaret, this is insane. We need to get out, call authorities, and tell them what? That there's an ancient chamber beneath Beacon Hill where children were sacrificed to some sleeping entity? Margaret shook her head. They'd think we're mad. Then we leave. Seal this place. Forget we found it. Margaret turned to her friend, eyes unnaturally bright in the dim chamber. You don't understand. I'm part of this now. One of the new 12. Eleanor identified us all before she died. Someone else has taken up her role as guardian, and they've been watching us, waiting, as if summoned by her words. Footsteps echoed from the staircase. Margaret and Diana turned to see Arthur, the elderly archivist, descending into the chamber. His familiar, kindly expression was gone, replaced by solemn purpose. You shouldn't have come here, Margaret, he said softly. Not yet. The gathering isn't complete. Arthur? Diana gasped. You're involved in this? The old man nodded. I took Eleanor's place when she passed. The guardian who watches, who prepares. Each cycle needs one who understands the responsibility. Margaret's mind raced. The registry, you made sure I found it. It was time for you to begin learning the truth. Though you've moved faster than I anticipated. Arthur approached the central table. Do you understand what you are, Margaret? What all 12 of you represent? Sacrifices, she whispered. Arthur's expression softened. No, protectors. The mark you bear isn't a death sentence, it's a connection, a bond to what sleeps below. He placed his palm against the crescent depression on the table. The chamber trembled again, more violently this time. Beneath Boston lies something ancient. Not malevolent, but not benevolent either. Simply powerful. Our ancestors discovered it centuries ago and learned that without the binding ritual, it would eventually awaken fully with catastrophic consequences. The children in 1904, Diana interjected. You killed them. Arthur shook his head. I wasn't born then. But yes, 11 were sacrificed, binding the entity for another cycle. Eleanor was meant to be the 12th, but she escaped, disrupting the ritual. She spent her life searching for an alternative solution. He turned to Margaret, and she found one. The 12 don't need to die. They need to serve as anchors, living connections that maintain the binding. One guardian to watch over them all. Margaret's birthmark burned with renewed intensity. That's why Eleanor identified the new 12. Not for sacrifice, but for initiation, Arthur finished. But the other 11 must be gathered. The ritual must be completed before the entity fully wakes. As if emphasizing his point, a deep rumbling shook the chamber, dislodging stones from the ceiling. It senses you, Margaret. The first of the 12 to connect with this place in the new cycle. Its stirring accelerates now. Margaret felt torn between horror and a strange sense of destiny. If what you're saying is true, we need to find the others. Diana stepped forward. Margaret, you can't possibly believe this. I don't know what I believe, Margaret admitted, but I feel the truth of it. This mark, this place, they're part of me somehow. Arthur nodded approvingly. The others are scattered across the city. Some know of their marks, but not their significance. Others, like you, have always carried the burden unaware. Another tremor, stronger than before, sent them stumbling. A large chunk of ceiling crashed onto one of the sarcophagi. We're out of time, Arthur said urgently. The disruption of finding this place prematurely has accelerated the awakening. We must gather the others immediately, or Boston will face destruction unlike anything seen since ancient times. Margaret looked between the elderly guardian and her friend, torn between academic skepticism and the undeniable reality surrounding them. I'll help you find them, she finally decided. But no sacrifices. We find another way. Arthur nodded solemnly, as Eleanor wished. Come, we must return to the surface. The first tremors will be felt throughout the city soon. As they ascended the stairs, Margaret cast one last glance at the chamber below, at the 11 small skeletons and the empty 12th alcove. Whatever had begun in 1904 with those marked children was coming full circle, and somehow she stood at the center of it all. The following morning, Boston awoke to news of an unexpected seismic event. Though measuring only 3.2 on the Richter scale, the tremor was unusual for New England. Experts interviewed on morning programs described it as anomalous and geologically inconsistent with the region's typical patterns. Margaret knew better. She sat in her apartment surrounded by papers spread across her coffee table, photocopies from Eleanor's journal, maps of Boston with locations circled in red, and most importantly, a list of names. The 11 others who shared her birthmark: Daniel Rossi, 43, chef at an Italian restaurant in the North End; Sophia Chun, 39, surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital; James Williams, 41, homeless man known to frequent Boston Common; Rebecca Okonkwo, 44, professor at MIT; Michael Fitzgerald, 40, police officer in South Boston. Lily Patel, 38, yoga instructor in Cambridge. Thomas Bergeron, 42, accountant working downtown. Sarah Kim, 39, librarian at a public school in Dorchester. Gabriel Morales, 41, janitor at the State House. Amelia Wright, 43, lawyer with a practice on Newberry Street. Noah Abelman, 40, rabbi at a synagogue in Brookline. 12 individuals with nothing in common except age range, geography, and a crescent-shaped birthmark on their left shoulder blade. 12 people who, according to Arthur, held the key to Boston's survival. Her phone rang. Diana. "Are you watching the news?" Diana asked without preamble. "About the earthquake?" "Yes. That's not all. There's been an incident at Massachusetts General. A surgeon collapsed during an operation, bleeding from her shoulder." Margaret's breath caught. "Sophia Chun?" "They didn't name her, but it fits." "Margaret, what's happening?" "The awakening is accelerating," Margaret said, the certainty in her voice surprising even her. "The marks are activating. We need to gather everyone quickly." Arthur had provided Margaret with addresses and contact information for all 11, compiled over years of careful observation. The Guardian's role, he'd explained, was to watch from a distance, never interfering until the time came. "I'm going to start contacting them today," Margaret told Diana, "starting with Sophia at the hospital." "I'm coming with you, Diana. This isn't your burden. It became mine when I followed you into that basement," Diana replied firmly. "Besides, you'll have better luck convincing people they're part of an ancient mystical binding ritual if you have someone backing up your story." Margaret couldn't argue with that logic. At Massachusetts General, they found Sophia Chun in a private room, hospital staff having attributed her collapse to exhaustion and a previously undocumented skin condition. The surgeon sat upright in bed, a bandage visible beneath her hospital gown. "Dr. Chun?" Margaret approached cautiously. "My name is Margaret Lowell. This might sound strange, but I need to talk to you about your birthmark." Sophia's eyes widened. "How do you know about that?" Margaret pulled down the collar of her shirt slightly, revealing the edge of her own bandaged mark. "Because I have the same one. And it's been bleeding, hasn't it?" For the next half hour, Margaret explained everything: the registry, Eleanor's journal, the chamber beneath Beacon Hill, and Arthur's revelations. Throughout the explanation, Sophia's expression shifted from skepticism to consideration to reluctant acceptance. "I've had dreams," Sophia finally admitted, "since childhood. Dreams of being underground, surrounded by children, all of us holding hands in a circle around. Something I can't quite see." Margaret nodded. "The binding ritual. Arthur believes we don't need to sacrifice ourselves like the children in 1904. We just need to renew the binding together. And if we don't," as if in answer, the building trembled slightly. Monitors beeped as patients throughout the floor called out in alarm. "That's the second tremor today," Sophia noted, her scientific mind still attempting to rationalize events. "You're suggesting these earthquakes are caused by some entity beneath the city?" "I know how it sounds," Margaret acknowledged. "But I've seen the chamber. It exists. Whatever's down there is waking up." Sophia was silent for a long moment before nodding decisively. "I've spent my career trusting evidence and instinct in equal measure. Right now, both are telling me you're not crazy." She swung her legs over the side of the bed. "When do we meet the others?" By evening, Margaret and Diana had successfully contacted 5 of the marked 12. Daniel Rossi had abandoned his restaurant mid-service when his mark began bleeding. Rebecca Okonkwo had experienced a similar episode during a lecture. Michael Fitzgerald had been more skeptical until the third minor. Earthquake had coincided exactly with a burning sensation across his shoulder blade. They gathered in Margaret's apartment, an unlikely assembly united by the strange marks they bore. Arthur joined them, bringing Thomas Bergeron, whom he'd contacted separately. 7 of us, Arthur noted. "More than halfway there? And the others?" Becca asked, the academic in her approaching the situation with analytical precision. "We've been unable to reach Lily Patel and Amelia Wright," Diana reported. "Noah Abelman agreed to meet us tomorrow morning. James Williams is harder to locate given his housing situation. And we've left messages for Sarah Kim and Gabriel Morales. Time is short," Arthur warned, gesturing toward the window where emergency vehicles' lights flashed in the distance. "The tremors are increasing in frequency and strength." "I still don't understand what we're binding," Michael said, the police officer's natural suspicion evident in his tone. "What exactly is down there?" Arthur sighed heavily. "The earliest records call it that which sleeps beneath. Native tribes avoided the area that became Boston, claiming the land was thin here, too close to something older than humanity. The colonists built anyway." Margaret continued, recalling details from Eleanor's journal. "But in the early days, there were incidents, disappearances, tremors, dreams that spread like contagion through the settlement." Until someone discovered the binding ritual, Arthur finished. Every 80 years, 12 children born with the mark would be gathered to renew the bonds. Daniel the chef leaned forward. So we're what psychic chains? More like anchors, Arthur corrected. Your connection to the entity allows you to direct your combined will toward maintaining its dormancy. Another tremor shook the apartment stronger than before. Pictures fell from walls. Car alarms activated in the street below. That was at least a 4.0, Rebecca estimated, her scientific background emerging. If they're increasing at this rate, we can't wait for the others, Sophia decided, her surgeon's decisiveness taking over. We need to perform this ritual now, with whoever we have. Arthur shook his head. It won't work. The binding requires all 12. Margaret's phone rang, Diana's caller ID displaying. She'd left 20 minutes earlier to check on Lily Patel. Diana? What's wrong? Diana's voice came through, breathless, frightened. Margaret, you need to come to Cambridge immediately. It's Lily. Something's happening to her. Her entire back is covered in these ... patterns spreading from the birthmark. She's in agony and she keeps saying she can hear it calling. Margaret looked at Arthur, whose expression had grown grave. The binding is failing faster than I thought. Without all 12 present, those with the mark will be drawn to it, consumed by the connection. We'll be right there, Margaret told Diana before addressing the group. We need to get to Cambridge now. And on the way, we need to keep trying to contact the others. Whatever is happening is accelerating. As they filed out of Margaret's apartment, the city's emergency sirens began to wail in the distance. The news would attribute it to precautionary measures following the unprecedented seismic activity. But Margaret and the others recognized it for what it truly was, a countdown to something ancient and terrible stirring beneath the streets of Boston. The binding was unraveling, and they were running out of time to restore it. The drive to Cambridge took twice as long as usual. Traffic clogged the streets as people evacuated buildings following the latest tremor. Emergency vehicles wove between cars, sirens wailing. On the radio, seismologists expressed bewilderment at the pattern of tremors, which seemed to radiate from a central point in Beacon Hill. They'll never understand what's really happening, Thomas said from the back seat of Margaret's car, where he sat with Rebecca and Sophia. How could they? Michael, who had insisted on driving his police cruiser with Daniel and Arthur, stayed in radio contact. His law enforcement credentials had proven useful in navigating the increasingly chaotic streets. Just got word of structural damage to buildings near Boston Common, Michael reported through Margaret's phone on speaker. Nothing catastrophic yet, but engineers are concerned about the unusual wave patterns. Arthur's voice came through next. The entity is testing its bonds, like a prisoner rattling the bars of a cell. They finally arrived at Lily Patel's yoga studio, a converted warehouse in Cambridge. Diana met them at the door, her face pale with worry. She's getting worse, Diana whispered, leading them inside. The patterns on her skin keep spreading, and she started speaking in, I don't even know what language it is. Lily lay on a yoga mat in her private studio, writhing in apparent pain. The simple crescent birthmark had transformed, extending tendrils of dark, vein-like patterns across her entire back. The lines pulsed with a subtle blue luminescence. It's consuming her, Arthur said grimly, kneeling beside the yoga instructor. The entity is attempting to claim one of its anchors. Lily's eyes fluttered open, but the warm brown Margaret had seen in photographs had been replaced by an opaque, milky white. When she spoke, her voice resonated with unnatural harmonics. The 12th gate opens. The binding thins. We rise, Rebecca asked sharply. Arthur looked grim. It's speaking through her. The entity isn't singular. It's collective. Margaret knelt beside Lily, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. She reached out, placing her palm against Lily's marked shoulder blade. Immediately, burning pain shot through Margaret's own mark. But with it came clarity, a vision of the chamber beneath Beacon Hill, the 11 sarcophagi, and the massive presence that stirred beneath the floor. They're connected, Margaret gasped. All of us were like junction points in a circuit. But the current is getting too strong. Another tremor shook the building, stronger than any previous. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. We need the others, Arthur insisted. Without all 12, the binding cannot be renewed. Margaret's phone rang, Noah Abelman calling. She answered quickly, putting him on speaker. Margaret, something's happening. My congregants evacuated after the tremors, but I can't leave. My back, the mark hits like it's anchoring me here. Where are you exactly? Michael asked, professional instincts taking over. My synagogue in Brookline, but I'm not alone. There's a man here, he says his name is James Williams. He was seeking shelter, but he has the same mark. He's in bad shape. Margaret and Arthur exchanged surprised looks. 2 more, Margaret counted. That makes 9 of us. Stay where you are, Michael instructed. We're coming to get you both. As Margaret ended the call, Sophia's phone chimed with a text message. It's from Amelia Wright, she reported. She says she's been trying to reach us. She's with Sarah Kim at the Boston Public Library. Sarah collapsed there while working. 10 and 11, Daniel noted. We're just missing Gabriel. We need to get everyone to the chamber, Arthur said firmly. It's the focal point of the binding. Only there can we renew the ritual. Rebecca frowned. But you said we need all 12. Arthur's expression turned grim. There's single quotes S ... an alternative. Eleanor discovered it. If we can gather 11 at the chamber, we can potentially stabilize the binding temporarily. It won't be permanent, but it might buy us time to find Gabriel. Why didn't you mention this before? Michael demanded. Because it requires one of you to serve as a conduit to temporarily take on the full burden of Gabriel's portion of the binding. It's dangerous, potentially fatal. The group fell silent, the implications settling heavily. I'll do it, Margaret finally said. This started with me finding the registry. It seems fitting. Margaret, no, Diana protested. We don't have a choice, Margaret insisted. Look at Lily. This is what happens when the binding fails. It will happen to all of us, and then whatever is down there will be free. Another violent tremor rocked the building. Outside, car alarms blared as a power line came down in a shower of sparks. The city is evacuating the affected areas, Michael reported, checking emergency broadcasts on his phone. They're attributing it to some kind of sinkhole or underground structural collapse. They're not entirely wrong, Arthur said dryly. They formed a plan quickly. Michael would use his police cruiser to collect Noah and James from the synagogue. Sophia, Rebecca, and Thomas would retrieve Amelia and Sarah from the library. Margaret, Diana, Daniel, and Arthur would transport Lily, now semi-conscious and mumbling in that strange language. Meet at Eleanor's house on Pinckney Street, Arthur instructed. The entrance to the chamber is there. As they prepared to separate, Margaret pulled Arthur aside. What aren't you telling us? What happens if the binding fails completely? The elderly guardian's face seemed to age another decade as he replied. The records aren't specific deliberately so, I suspect. But they speak of a time before the first binding, when the entities below were more ... awake. They fed on human consciousness, dreams, fears. They shaped reality around themselves. And if they wake fully now, in a city of nearly 700,000 people, Arthur met her gaze directly. They would consume every mind within their reach, Margaret, and then they would spread. The gravity of their task settled on Margaret's shoulders as Boston continued to tremble around them. The ancient presence below stretching against bonds that had held for generations, bonds that 12 ordinary people with crescent birthmarks were somehow meant to restore. Night fell over Boston as the city descended into chaos. The governor had declared a state of emergency. National Guard units deployed to assist with evacuations. Scientists scrambled to explain the unprecedented seismic activity concentrated beneath one of America's oldest cities, through streets choked with fleeing residents and emergency vehicles. Okay. The Mark 12 converged on Pinckney Street, or rather 11 of them did. Gabriel Morales, the State House janitor, remained missing despite desperate attempts to locate him. Margaret stood on Eleanor Davis's doorstep, watching as Michael's police cruiser arrived with Noah and James. The rabbi supported the homeless man, whose condition mirrored Lily's. The crescent birthmark had spread tendrils across his back, his eyes clouded with that same milky opacity. He's been talking in that language too, Noah explained, helping James up the steps. Sometimes it seems like he's having a conversation with someone none of us can see. The group from the library arrived minutes later. Sarah Kim was unconscious, carried between Rebecca and Thomas, while Amelia Wright followed with a shell-shocked expression. The patterns have reached her neck, Amelia reported, gesturing to the librarian, and she started bleeding from her eyes about 10 minutes ago. Get them all inside, Arthur directed, holding the door open. Straight to the basement. Margaret helped Diana guide the semi-conscious Lily through the foyer. Any luck finding Gabriel? She asked Arthur. The guardian shook his head. His supervisor said he left work early, complaining of back pain. His apartment is empty. Then we proceed with 11, Margaret decided. I'll serve as the conduit. The hidden entrance to the chamber stood open, the bookshelf pushed aside. Blue light pulsed from below, matching the rhythm of the tremors now occurring every few minutes. It's responding to our presence, Arthur explained as they descended the spiral staircase. It senses the marked ones approaching. The chamber had changed since Margaret's first visit. The symbols carved into the columns now glowed with the same blue luminescence as the patterns on Lily and James's skin. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Most disturbing, the stone floor at the center of the room had developed hairline fractures that pulsed with light. It's directly below us, Arthur said, his voice hushed with dread. Pressing against the final barrier, the 11 marked individuals gathered around the central stone table. where the crescent depression now shimmered with liquid blue light. "What do we do?" Michael asked, police training giving way to uncertainty in the face of the incomprehensible. Arthur guided them to form a circle around the table. "Each of you place your left hand on the stone. The ritual is simple but demanding. You must visualize the binding 12 chains holding something vast in place. But one chain is missing. Mine will substitute temporarily," Margaret said. "Yes," Arthur confirmed grimly, "but it means your connection will bear twice the strain. The others each hold one portion of the binding. You'll hold two." Diana grabbed Margaret's arm. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Margaret said with calm resignation. "Not unless Gabriel appears in the next few minutes." As if timed to her words, the largest tremor yet shook the chamber violently. Chunks of ceiling crashed down around them. The fractures in the floor widened, glowing brighter. "Now," Arthur shouted over the rumbling. "Begin the binding." 11 hands pressed against the stone table. Immediately, blue light spread from the crescent depression, flowing up their arms and converging on their birthmarks. Margaret gasped as burning pain erupted across her shoulder blade, twice as intense as before. Through the pain, she visualized, as Arthur had instructed, chains extending from each of them, wrapping around something massive below. Where Gabriel's chain should have been, she imagined her own connection splitting, stretching to cover the gap. The others began to chant involuntarily, the strange language that had emerged from Lily and James now flowing from all their lips. Margaret understood none of the words, yet somehow comprehended their purpose: words of binding, of containment, of delineation between above and below. The light intensified, the chamber vibrating with power as the ritual progressed. Margaret felt her consciousness extending downward, through the fractured floor, into a space that shouldn't exist, a vast cavern beneath Boston where something ancient stirred. Not something, she realized with horror. Many things. A collective consciousness composed of countless entities, merged over millennia into a singular purpose: to rise, to feed, to expand. As her awareness touched this mass, it reacted, tendrils of alien thought probing at her mind, seeking purchase. Margaret struggled to maintain the visualization of the binding chains, even as the entity attempted to overwhelm her. "You are insufficient," a voice that was many voices whispered directly into her mind. "The 12th anchor is required. You cannot hold." "I have to," Margaret gasped aloud, fighting to maintain her grip on the stone table as blood began to stream from her nose, her ears, her eyes. Diana watched in horror as the pattern spread visibly across Margaret's skin, creeping up her neck toward her face. "She can't sustain this," she shouted to Arthur. "It's killing her." Arthur's expression was one of grim resignation. "If she breaks, the binding fails completely." The chamber shuddered violently. A large section of ceiling collapsed near the entrance, narrowly missing Diana. The fractures in the floor widened further, blue light pouring upward. Through her mental connection to the entity, Margaret sensed its growing excitement. The binding was weakening. It had waited centuries, and freedom was moments away. "We will rise," the voices promised. "We will feed. Beginning with you, the failed anchor." Margaret's strength was failing. The strain of holding both her portion of the binding and Gabriel's vacant section was too great. Her visualization of the chains began to waver, the metaphysical links stretching dangerously thin. "I can single quotes quotes," she gasped. Just as her grip on the table began to loosen, the chamber door above crashed open. Heavy footsteps pounded down the spiral staircase. Gabriel Morales stumbled into the chamber, his maintenance uniform torn and bloody, his eyes wild with fear and recognition. "I've been having dreams of this place for weeks," he panted, trying to ignore them, but tonight, the mark, the pain. He stared at the circle of 11, understanding dawning. "I'm the last one, aren't I?" "Quickly," Arthur shouted, gesturing to the space between Margaret and Daniel. "Take your place." Gabriel rushed forward, placing his hand on the table. Immediately, blue light engulfed his arm, racing toward his birthmark. Margaret felt a surge of relief as the double burden lifted, Gabriel's presence completing the circuit. With 12 anchors now in place, the binding ritual intensified. The blue light pulsed through the chamber in perfect synchronization with their heartbeats. The strange chant grew louder, more harmonious. Below, the entity raged against the strengthening bonds. Margaret sensed its fury, its hunger, and its growing realization that once again it would be contained. Next time, the voices promised as the binding took hold. "When the anchors weaken, when the cycle turns, we will be waiting." The light reached blinding intensity. The chanting crescendoed to a pitch almost beyond human hearing. And then, abruptly, both ceased. Silence fell over the chamber. The tremors stopped. The fractures in the floor sealed themselves, the blue glow fading to a subtle luminescence. One by one, the 12 removed their hands from the table, stumbling backward in exhaustion. The marks on their shoulder blades still burned, but the pain was subsiding. For Lily, James, and Sarah, the spreading patterns receded, returning to the simple crescent shape. "Is it done?" Rebecca asked, scientific mind struggling to process what they'd experienced. Arthur nodded, his aged face showing profound relief. "The binding is renewed. Boston is safe. For now." "For how long?" Michael demanded. "Traditionally 80 years between cycles," Arthur explained. "But with the disruption to this awakening, I can't be certain. It could be less." "So our children might face this," Noah said quietly. "Or our grandchildren." Margaret leaned heavily against the table, drained but oddly at peace. "Then we'll have to prepare them, like Eleanor prepared for us." "You would take on the guardian's role?" Arthur asked, studying her intently. Margaret looked around at the 11 others who shared her mark, her burden, her connection to something beyond human understanding. Strangers days ago, now linked by an experience no one else could comprehend. Not alone, she decided. "We all will. 12 guardians instead of 1. We'll watch for the signs, identify the next 12 when they appear, and guide them better than we were guided." Arthur smiled faintly. Eleanor would approve of that innovation. As they made their way back up the stairs, exhausted but united, Boston lay quiet above them. Emergency services would attribute the cessation of tremors to natural causes. Scientists would debate the anomalous seismic event for years. The public would eventually forget, as humans always did. But 12 individuals bearing crescent birthmarks would remember. They would meet regularly in the chamber beneath Beacon Hill, strengthening their connections to each other and to the binding they maintained. They would research, prepare, and watch for children born with the mark. And deep below, that which slept beneath Boston would continue its dreams, waiting for the next opportunity to rise. 1 year later, Margaret stood in the rare books department of the Boston Public Library, watching as Sarah Kim carefully preserved Eleanor Davis's journal in archival quality materials. "Future guardians will need this," Sarah explained, her librarian's training evident in her meticulous handling of the fragile document, along with our own records. In the months following the binding ritual, the 12 had formalized their roles as guardians. Sarah and Rebecca documented everything, their experiences. Research into previous cycles, theories about the entity below. Noah provided spiritual guidance, helping them process the psychological impact of their connection to something beyond human comprehension. Michael used his police contacts to create a network for monitoring unusual seismic activities across New England. Most importantly, they had begun identifying potential locations of other binding sites. Arthur's research suggests Boston isn't unique, Margaret noted, reviewing their latest findings. Similar cyclic seismic anomalies have been recorded in 7 other locations worldwide, places where ancient settlements overlap with modern cities. Which means other groups of 12, Sarah concluded. Other bindings, and potentially other entities, Margaret added. Their research had led them to corresponding patterns across history, 12 individuals in each generation, marked from birth, who either disappeared together or lived remarkably long lives as recluses. In some cultures, they were revered as shamans or oracles. In others, they were feared as witches or demons. I've made contact with a researcher in Prague who's documented similar birthmarks in historical records there, Rebecca reported, joining them with a stack of printouts. She's skeptical of our supernatural explanation, but agrees that the pattern is statistically impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "Do we tell her everything?" Sarah asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Not yet, but we leave breadcrumbs like Eleanor did for me. The right people will follow them when the time comes." The library door opened as Sophia arrived, carrying coffee for everyone. "Good news from Daniel," she announced. "He's identified a child born 3 months ago with the mark, the first of the next 12. The cycle was beginning again, earlier than expected. The binding they'd created wasn't lasting as long as previous iterations. We have decades to prepare them," Margaret reminded the others. "To make sure they understand their purpose before the dreams start, before the entity begins calling to them." Later that evening, Margaret returned to Eleanor Davis's house on Pinckney Street, her house now. Buckwith through a complex legal arrangement Arthur had revealed after the binding. The guardian's residence passed from one cycle to the next. She descended to the chamber alone, something she did weekly to monitor the binding's strength. The blue glow remained steady, the stone floor intact. Yet as she approached the central table, Margaret felt a familiar pressure at the edges of her consciousness. The entity, sensing her presence. "Guardian," the many voices whispered. "You have questions." Margaret had grown accustomed to these brief communications. The entity couldn't break the binding, but it could reach through the connection she shared with it. "What are you?" she asked aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber. "We are the first dreams of this world," came the reply. "Before humans dreamed, we shaped, we created, and now you're trapped, as are you, Guardian. Bound to us as we are bound to you, cycles within cycles." Margaret pressed her palm against the crescent depression on the table, feeling the familiar burn of connection. Why Boston? Why any of these cities? The entity's response came as a series of impressions rather than words. Thin places where the boundary between worlds naturally weakened, locations where dreams flowed more easily between realms, points where consciousness itself had different properties. "You think you contain us," the voices continued, "but we merely sleep. And in sleep we still influence. Every nightmare in your city, every moment of inexplicable dread, every creative inspiration that seems to come from nowhere, all us, leaking through your imperfect binding." The revelation sent a chill through Margaret. "You're saying you affect Boston's collective consciousness even while bound? Why do you think your city dreams as it does? Why do your writers craft the stories they tell? Why do your citizens fear what they fear?" Margaret thought of Boston's literary history, the Gothic horrors of Hawthorne, the cosmic dread of Lovecraft, who lived just south in Providence, the psychological tensions woven through the works of Henry James, all emerging from a region where something ancient dreamed beneath the streets. Are there others like you, in other cities? We are many, and one. Different aspects, different dreams. Prague dreams of golems and clockworks. Venice dreams of masks and decay. Alexandria dreams of lost knowledge. Each bound by 12, each leaking through. The implications were staggering. Human culture itself shaped by these entities, these ancient dreamers. "And if you were completely unbound?" Margaret asked, though she feared the answer. The response came as a vision reality itself reshaped by dream logic. The thin membrane between consciousness and subconsciousness dissolved completely. Human minds unable to distinguish between what was real and what was merely dreamed into existence. "Freedom," the voices whispered. "For us, madness for you." Margaret withdrew her hand from the table, the connection breaking. She understood now why the binding was so important, not just to prevent physical destruction through earthquakes, but to maintain the very stability of reality itself. As she climbed the spiral staircase back to her home, Margaret felt the weight of her responsibility anew. The 12 weren't just protecting Boston from physical devastation. They were preserving the boundary between waking and dreaming for every mind in the city, in the study that had once belonged to Eleanor Davis. Margaret opened a leather-bound journal, her own record for future guardians. On the first page she had written a warning and a promise. "Beneath Boston sleeps something ancient, something that dreams. We are its jailers and its conduits. We are the 12 who bind and the 12 who connect. We bear the mark of our purpose, not chosen by fate, but by something that recognized in us the strength to stand at the boundary between worlds. The binding will hold as long as we remember, as long as we prepare, as long as we stand together. And when the time comes for the next 12 to take our place, we will be ready." In a dozen homes across Boston, 11 others with crescent birthmarks felt a momentary burning sensation. Margaret's connection to the entity rippling through their shared bond. Each paused in their evening activities, acknowledging the reminder of what slept beneath their city and what they had sworn to contain. The mark of 12, the binding of generations, the ancient dream that must never fully awaken. 5 years passed. Boston thrived. Its citizens blissfully unaware of what lay beneath their streets, or the 12 individuals who maintained the boundary between reality and something far stranger. On a crisp October morning, Margaret sat in a coffee shop across from the elementary school where the first child of the new 12 had just begun kindergarten. Emma Vasquez played happily in the schoolyard, unaware of the crescent birthmark on her shoulder blade or its significance. "She seems so normal," Diana commented, joining Margaret at her table with 2 steaming cups. In the years since the binding, Diana had become Margaret's closest confidant, though she bore no mark herself. "They all do at first," Margaret replied, watching the child. "The dreams won't start for years yet." They had identified 7 of the next generation, so far children born within months of each other, all within Boston city limits, all bearing the telltale mark. The guardians monitored them discreetly, ensuring their safety while allowing them normal childhoods for as long as possible. "Rebecca's theory is holding true," Margaret continued. "The new 12 are appearing faster than in previous cycles. The binding is weakening more quickly." "How long?" Diana asked, the question they all dreaded. Margaret sighed. 30 years, perhaps less. Not the traditional 80. Whatever disrupted the previous cycle, Eleanor, escaping her fate. Perhaps. has accelerated the pattern. Their coffee was interrupted by a text message from Sophia. Tremor detected beneath Cambridge. Minor, 1.2 magnitude. Localized. Though imperceptible to most residents, the Guardians had developed extreme sensitivity to even the slightest movements from below. Each tremor, however small, represented a testing of the binding, the entity shifting in its metaphysical sleep. Third one this month, Margaret noted with concern. More frequent than last year. Diana frowned. I thought the binding was secure. It is, but not static. It breathes, fluctuates. And lately those fluctuations have been increasing. After finishing their coffee, Margaret and Diana drove to MIT, where Rebecca had established a specialized seismology lab ostensibly studying microtremors throughout New England. In reality, it served as the scientific headquarters for the Guardians' monitoring efforts. Rebecca greeted them in a basement lab filled with sensitive equipment. Michael and Noah were already there, studying readouts with concerned expressions. The pattern is changing, Rebecca explained without preamble, pointing to a three-dimensional model of subsurface activity. Previous tremors radiated outward from the chamber. This one originated 2 miles east, then propagated toward the chamber. What does that mean? Diana asked. Noah, who had developed an almost mystical understanding of their connection to the entity, answered grimly. It means it's not just testing the binding anymore. It's looking for weaknesses, alternative routes. Like water seeking cracks in a dam, Michael added. Margaret studied the data, feeling the birthmark on her shoulder blade tingle in response. It's evolving its approach. Learning from previous failures. Precisely, Rebecca confirmed. These readings suggest it's attempting to create secondary pressure points, locations where the barrier between its realm and ours might be thinner. The implications were disturbing. Their understanding of the entity had been based on historical patterns, 80-year cycles. A single binding location, a relatively passive containment. If it was adapting, developing new strategies, we need to visit the chamber, Margaret decided. All 12 of us, tonight. Hours later, as darkness fell over Boston, 12 individuals with crescent birthmarks gathered in the hidden chamber beneath Pinckney Street. They stood in a circle around the central table where the blue glow pulsed slightly faster than it had during their last group visit. Join hands, Margaret instructed. We need to strengthen the binding together. As their circle closed, the familiar burning sensation spread from their birthmarks, creating a circuit of energy through their shared connection. Margaret sensed the other's consciousness, Sophia's analytical precision, Daniel's creative intuition, Noah's spiritual depth, each mind uniquely attuned to different aspects of their strange bond. And below, the entity stirred in response to their presence. The Guardians gather, the many voices whispered into their collective awareness. How ... unprecedented. Margaret served as the primary conduit for communication, her connection stronger than the others through years of regular contact. We've detected your attempts to circumvent the binding, she addressed it mentally. Testing new locations, seeking weaknesses. The entity's response came as a ripple of amusement. Evolution is the nature of all things. We evolve. You evolved from sacrifices to guardians. Why should we remain static? The binding was designed to contain you in one location, Noah projected, to prevent your influence from spreading. Yet I already influence far beyond your chamber. Every dream in this city bears my touch. Every nightmare, my signature. As if to demonstrate, the entity sent a pulse of energy through their connection, not attacking the binding, but temporarily intensifying its natural leakage. Throughout Boston, thousands of sleepers shifted restlessly as strange dreams infiltrated their minds. Dreamers found themselves in twisted versions of familiar streets, pursued by shapeless fears or confronted with impossible geometries. Margaret and the others felt these dreams rippling outward from the chamber like concentric waves. Stop this, Margaret demanded, strengthening her portion of the binding. The entity complied, the wave of disturbed dreams subsiding. A reminder of what already exists, Guardian. Your binding does not eliminate our influence, it merely moderates it. What are you attempting with these new tremor patterns? Rebecca questioned directly, her scientific mind seeking concrete answers. Instead of responding with words, the entity shared a vision, a network spreading beneath Boston, tendrils extending from the central chamber toward specific locations throughout the city. Nodes, Daniel realized aloud. It's creating secondary nodes, the world changes above. New structures, new concentrations of consciousness. We adapt to where your kind gather. The vision clarified, revealing that the secondary nodes corresponded to locations of significant human activity, hospitals, universities, transportation hubs. Places where human minds clustered in states of heightened emotion or altered consciousness. It's targeting locations where people are vulnerable, Sophia interpreted. where the boundary between conscious and unconscious thought is already compromised, Margaret understood with sudden clarity. It's creating a network to distribute the pressure against the binding. If it can't break through here, it will attempt smaller breaches elsewhere. The entity neither confirmed nor denied this interpretation, but Margaret sensed its satisfaction at their understanding. We can strengthen the binding here, Gabriel pointed out, but we can't be in all these locations simultaneously. The challenge was evident. The binding ritual worked in the chamber because it was the focal point, the primary connection to what lay below. These secondary nodes might be individually weaker, but they were potentially numerous and widely distributed. As the Guardians maintained their circle, Margaret felt a new sensation through their connection, a gentle tugging, not from below, but from elsewhere in the city. Following the sensation mentally, she perceived 7 distinct points of awareness. The children, she gasped, releasing Noah and Daniel's hands as the realization struck her. The new 12, they're responding to this surge of activity. They're too young, Amelia protested. They shouldn't be sensitive to the binding yet. But they are, Margaret insisted. I can feel them. The entity is aware of them too. The next anchor's already formed, the many voices confirmed. Earlier than before. Interesting. A disturbing possibility formed in Margaret's mind. You're accelerating the cycle deliberately, pushing harder against the binding so the next 12 manifest sooner. Adaptation. Evolution. The binding weakens. New anchors form in response. Natural balance. But why? Thomas demanded. If new anchors form to strengthen the binding when it weakens, you'll never break free. The entity's response came as a sensation rather than words, a feeling of patient anticipation, of strategies unfolding across timescales humans could barely comprehend. We play a longer game than you imagined, Guardians. Each cycle teaches us. Each binding reveals new possibilities. As the entity withdrew from communication, the blue glow in the chamber stabilized, the tremors subsiding. The 12 Guardians broke their circle, physically exhausted but mentally alert with new understanding. It's not just testing the binding, Margaret explained as they gathered in Eleanor's study afterward. It's testing us, learning our responses, our limitations. And the children, Sarah added worriedly. It's aware of them much earlier than it should be. Michael paced the room, the tactical thinker among them. We need to expand our monitoring network, cover these secondary nodes it's attempting to establish, and accelerate our preparation of the next 12, Noah suggested. If the entity is already reaching toward them, they'll need protection and understanding sooner than we planned. Margaret nodded in agreement, the weight of their responsibility growing heavier. What had seemed a successful binding 5 years ago now revealed itself as merely one move in a complex game played across generations. Game where their opponent measured time in centuries and possessed patience beyond human comprehension. As the Guardians dispersed to their homes across Boston, Margaret remained in Eleanor's study, reviewing the journal entries from previous cycles. A pattern emerged that she hadn't noticed before. Each generation of Guardians believed they had succeeded, only for the next to face an evolved threat. The entity wasn't trying to break free in one dramatic event. It was gradually, incrementally expanding its influence, adapting to each new binding, learning from each new set of Guardians. Margaret opened her own journal and wrote, "We face not just an ancient power, but an intelligent one. It does not rage against its bonds, but studies them. It does not merely sleep beneath Boston, but dreams actively, purposefully. And most concerning, it recognizes the children who will one day replace us as Guardians. The question is no longer whether we can maintain the binding until the next 12 take our place. The question is whether the binding itself, in its current form, remains sufficient for what lies below." As she wrote these words, the birthmark on her shoulder blade pulsed faintly, as if in acknowledgement of a truth the entity had always known and the Guardians were only beginning to understand. 10 years after the binding, Boston experienced its coldest winter in decades. Record snowfall buried the city, transforming familiar streets into Arctic landscapes. Schools closed for weeks. Emergency services struggled to keep pace with the increasing demands. What meteorologists couldn't explain was why the cold centered so precisely on Boston, creating a perfect circle of extreme conditions that ended abruptly at the city limits. Beyond that invisible boundary, temperatures remained seasonally appropriate. The 12 Guardians knew the truth. The entity below was flexing its influence, testing not just the physical binding but its ability to affect conditions above ground. In the decades since their first binding ritual, they had adapted their approach as the entity had evolved its own. The original chamber beneath Pinckney Street remained their primary focus, but they had established monitoring stations at each of the secondary nodes the entity had attempted to creates 17 locations throughout Boston where the boundary between worlds grew periodically thin. Margaret stood at the window of her Beacon Hill home watching snow swirl in patterns too precise to be natural. Behind her, the other guardians had gathered for their monthly meeting, joined now by new faces, the parents of the next 12, brought gradually into their confidence as their children's sensitivity to the entity increased. "Emma drew this last night," Teresa Vasquez said, unfolding a large sheet of paper on Margaret's dining table. Her daughter, now 15, had sketched a detailed map of Boston with 17 points connected by flowing lines to a central location. Perfect representation of the entity's network, though Emma had never been shown it. "The dreams are getting stronger," David Shun added. His son Andrew, 14, was another of the next 12. He woke up screaming again, talking about the many who are one. The guardians exchanged concerned glances. The children were manifesting awareness far earlier than expected, their connections to the entity developing before they were emotionally or psychologically prepared. "We need to accelerate their training," Sophia suggested. "They're connecting to it whether we prepare them or not." "They're too young," Teresa protested. "Emma should be worrying about school dances, not eldritch horrors beneath the city." Margaret sympathized with the parents' concerns. Unlike the current guardians who had stumbled into their roles as adults, the next generation was growing up with the knowledge of what awaited them. The burden was heavy, even with careful preparation. "We don't have a choice," Margaret said gently. "The entity is reaching for them already. Better they understand what's happening than face it confused and afraid." As they discussed next steps, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Michael answered it, returning with Arthur, now 93, frail but still sharp-minded. "It's happening," the former guardian announced without preamble. "The pattern is completing itself." He placed a Boston Globe article on the table. The headline read, "Mystery Illness Affects Boston Teens." The story detailed 17 adolescents, hospitalized with identical symptoms, severe migraines, vivid hallucinations, and strange marks appearing on their skin. "These 17, Arthur pointed to the article, plus the 12 we're already monitoring equals 29. "That's impossible," Rebecca objected. "There are only supposed to be 12 in each generation." Arthur shook his head. "That was the pattern we understood. But I've been researching the oldest records, documents that predate the first formal binding. The original ritual involved 29 individuals arranged in a precise geometric pattern, 12 primary anchors and 17 secondary ones. The implications stunned the room into silence. Their understanding of the binding had been incomplete. The entity isn't just creating secondary nodes, Margaret realized. It's attempting to restore the original configuration of the binding, but under its control rather than ours. "Exactly," Arthur confirmed. "These 17 new adolescents, it's marking them itself, creating its own anchors to balance the 12 natural ones." The room erupted with questions and concerns. Parents worried for their children's safety, guardians debated their response. Through it all, Margaret felt the familiar pressure at the edge of her consciousness, the entity, watching through her connection, studying their reaction to its latest move. "We need to find these 17 teenagers immediately," Margaret announced, cutting through the chaos. "Before the entity's influence over them strengthens." They divided responsibilities quickly. Michael would use police resources to identify the hospitalized teens. Rebecca would establish medical monitoring. Parents would prepare to welcome 17 new families into their unusual community. As the meeting dispersed with newfound urgency, Margaret, Diana, and Arthur remained at the dining table, studying Emma's drawing more carefully. "The geometry is significant," Arthur noted, tracing the lines between nodes. "It forms a containment pattern similar to what I found in the pre-colonial records. It's not a simple circle, but a complex web of interconnected points. Like a neural network," Diana suggested. "Distributed processing instead of a central hub." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. "It's not trying to escape the binding," she said slowly. "It's trying to redefine it, to transform a prison into a nervous system, with Boston as its body," Arthur concluded grimly. The snow intensified outside, windows rattling as wind patterns shifted unnaturally. Throughout the city, 29 adolescents well-born with the mark and 17 newly branded by the entity, tossed in troubled sleep, their dreams converging on a singular consciousness that had waited centuries for this alignment. In the chamber beneath Pinckney Street, the blue glow pulsed with unprecedented intensity, no longer contained to the central table but spreading through the entire space, illuminating the 11 sarcophagi of children sacrificed in 1904 and the empty 12th that should have held Eleanor Davis. The binding was not breaking, it was transforming, and neither the current guardians nor the next generation fully understood what it was becoming. As Margaret prepared to lead her fellow guardians into this new phase of their ancient obligation, she wrote a final entry in the journal she had maintained for a decade. What sleeps beneath Boston is awakening. Not to break free, but to incorporate us into something larger than we comprehended. The 12 who bind, and the 17 who connect a pattern older than the city itself, older perhaps than human civilization. We stand at a threshold between resistance and adaptation, between maintaining a deteriorating boundary and negotiating a new relationship with something we've only begun to understand. The children will face choices we never imagined. May they find wisdom where we found only fear, and possibility where we saw only threat. The mark of 12 becomes the mark of 29. The binding evolves, and Boston dreams new dreams under the watchful consciousness below. Outside, the snow stopped abruptly as if a switch had been flipped. Across the city, 17 newly marked teenagers opened their eyes simultaneously, their irises briefly glowing with the same blue light that pulsed beneath Beacon Hill. The entity had made its move. Now the guardians would make theirs, and the next generation caught between worlds, between binding and becoming, would determine what Boston would ultimately become, a city that contains something ancient, or a city that transformed into something new. The registry that Margaret had discovered in the library archives 15 years earlier had been just the first page of a story still being written, a story of 29 birthmarks, of boundaries redrawn, and of ancient dreams merging with human consciousness in ways no guardian had ever anticipated. The mark of 12 had always been just the beginning.